Welcome to our lecture on Peter Abelard. This is a remarkable figure from the beginning of the most vibrant period in the Middle Ages. We've seen in previous discussions how Europe had entered into a profound age of inanition because of population collapse that led the end of the Roman Empire in the West, along with the other demographic changes such as the influx of the Germanic tribes. And at this point we have, Abelard's born in 1079. We're talking about the beginning of the High Middle Ages, when population is recovering. Cities are beginning to revive. There's enough people to reinvigorate commerce and trade. And there is, most importantly perhaps, catching fire of philosophy in the West, especially the work of Aristotle, which had come in at this point mainly transmitted through Andalusia, the Muslim territory in what we now call Spain. Toledo was conquered by the Christians in a little after Abelard's birth. That helped to bring into Europe a lot of the riches of the Greek philosophical heritage that had not been preserved in the monastic chain of the scriptoria, the work which especially was able to preserve the Latin classics, but not the Greek as much. So in 1079, this interesting figure, Peter Abelard, was born in Le Palais in Brittany, which was not part of the Kingdom of France. It was its own duchy. So when he talks about in his autobiography, The History of My Calamities, he talks about going to France when he goes to Paris because there was a different polity, as it were. This was the beginning of the consolidation of French power under the Capetian dynasty, which had to fight its way from a little enclave around Paris called the Ile-de-France. Eventually, over centuries, was able to constitute the nation that we know now. But at this point, he's leaving a Celtic area, going to Paris when he goes to study. He's going to study, and that means that he's leaving behind the inheritance that he could have as the eldest son of a knight. So the normal thing to do in his position would be to enter into the knightly class, inherit, and to live a life of martial valor and glory. He instead opts for a life of ideas. He exemplifies really what has come to be called the 12th century Renaissance. We find Renaissance everywhere, but one can see why this might apply to the 1100s, with the revival of population, with the influx of the Aristotelian ideas, and the atmosphere, especially in Paris, which was still a small town, I think around 50,000. The cities of Europe were not large, and this is in comparison to the great metropolises of the Islamic world. So we have here the city of Paris, which is at the heart of that Carolingian idea of the Christendom at this point. It's alive with the excitement of new thoughts, logic and dialectic, which had come in from especially this grouping of Aristotle's writings called the organon, the instrument. You have a preface with this work by Porphyry called the Isagogy, and aided by the commentary on that work by Boethius. You have this confidence that's rising that human thought can traverse the world and into heaven, and to think fresh and think anew. Thoughts that up until that point had been passed on as a matter of a simple receptivity. And that was seen in the monastic way of study, which was not a matter of trying to innovate. It was not a matter of trying to put one's personal stamp on the tradition. It was a matter of receiving it, lectio, reading, without disputatio, without disputation. So this was going to be his arena of, and these are the metaphors he uses in his autobiography. He's going to be a knight of the mind, as it were. And he's got the title Palatinus because of the town he comes from, Le Palais. But the Palatine master refers to the fact that it plays off the fact, or would be taken to play off the fact that he was a paladin, right? A knightly warrior of the mind, and indeed would be assimilated to the knight, the troubadour, the chivalric knight who loves because of his romance with Eloise, which we'll talk about. So I want to frame these thoughts in terms of a question: should one live by the eros of the mind? Right? This was something that was catching fire in Europe for the first time in centuries. It had already been there. We've seen in Baghdad with the House of Wisdom and other cultural centers in the Islamic world. But here, and so the Muslim philosophers were already doing this work for centuries. Here we're seeing it's really taking hold in Europe. Abelard is right on, he's right in the forefront of this movement. So what we see with Abelard is the emergence of a new subjectivity, a modern subject, recognizably modern, certainly in the fact that his mind just is restless and wants to take tradition in and to make something new of it. There's also a reference, though, the modern subjectivity includes the romantic subjectivity, and that's seen with his relationship with Heloise. And here we can talk about another kind of eros, right? An eros that takes the whole person, including sexuality. And that's part of the question here. Should one live by the eros of the mind? Is there another kind of eros that would be more comprehensive or not? What desires, what loves should we live by? And I think that's, as individuals, but also as a civilization, right? What are the loves that should drive us as a corporate project? So he goes to Paris, where these ideas are really taking hold, where the cathedral schools, which Charlemagne had ordered to be raised in cities, there was one associated with Notre Dame. That would become the core of the Sorbonne. There was a corporation of students and masters around 1150 out of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, and that would be part of the nucleus of the university. And that was the second in Europe. Of course, we've seen the Nizamiya in the Islamic world, and Al-Azhar, but in Europe, this was the second oldest university, the oldest. Having that name, in fact, was Bologna. Universitas was assigned to that, which was well known for law. The great center for medical training would have been Salerno, and Paris would be the preeminent center for theological training, and that was the preeminent science of the time. So what happened in theology actually was a matter of the most profound interest for this civilization. So when we're talking here about the shift from the monastic to the scholastic, a shift from what we've seen in terms of the Benedictine way of life, a way of kind of attending to carefully preserving tradition. And now we have this more dynamic interplay between tradition and the subject, who we are receiving the tradition. And it's a matter of synthesizing faith and reason. This is the great medieval question for Jews, Muslims, Christians. How do we synthesize faith and reason? And Aristotle's always right at the heart of that. Key in this transition from the monastic to the scholastic is, paradoxically enough, a Benedictine, St. Anselm of Canterbury, also known as Anselm of Bec or Anselm of Aosta, so that could be confusing. And one of his students was Anselm of Laon. So one has to be careful which Anselm we're talking about. But in the late 11th century, he was already trying to use reason to reach to God. The ontological proof, for instance, proving God by reason. A very pious man. Again, one can compare Anselm to Al-Ghazali. Okay, there were monastics who continued the tradition of the more pious, reverent disposition towards tradition. The Victorines, of the Hugh and Richard of St. Victor, for instance, of the Abbey of St. Victor, which had a was greatly influenced by one of the men that Abelard tussled with, William of Champeaux, when he first got to Paris. This was the teacher that Abelard said he was able to discomfit because of his superior. Abelard was not a modest man. He would say he was able to best William of Champeaux. So the Abbey of St. Victor was a source of this continuing, very vital monastic tradition. And of course, the other big name here would be Bernard of Clairvaux, who would end up being a major antagonist of Abelard's. Out of this matrix of both the monastic and Anselm, we get Peter Lombard, who was a student at one time of Abelard's, and his work, the Sentences, a collection of propositions from the Fathers and Scripture, trying to encompass all of the questions in theology. This was one of the matrices of scholastic method, because what Lombard is doing is arranging all of these authors and not hiding the fact that sometimes these authors disagree. They have different answers to the question. So the question is, what do you do with that? Lombard does it much more gently than Abelard's own version of this, which is a book called Sic et Non, which is yes and no. These are both extremely important works for the development of scholasticism. Peter Lombard's Sentences, in fact, is the most commentated, the work that is most commented upon, other than the Bible, in the Christian theological tradition. It used to be a standard school exercise for theologians that they had to write a commentary on Lombard's Sentences. Abelard's version of this was Sic et Non. It was not as gentle, not as desirous of reconciling the monastic and the scholastic. He still wanted, the point wasn't to have a statement from Augustine and a statement from Athanasius and say, well, look, see, they disagree, therefore it's we don't know what to believe in. That wasn't the point. He put them next to each other and was trying to say, we can think these things through. Now, again, it was his confidence in the new tools of the mind, logic and dialectic. All right, one other thing that we can see about scholasticism, which we'll talk about more when we get to Thomas Aquinas, but at this time, you've got the possibility of the civilizations talking to each other. The Greek East at Byzantium, the Islamic world. You can have dialogue if logic and dialectic are a common tool for human interaction. And so that's the work we've got, a dialogue. So we obviously Plato, that's what he did, was to present thought in terms of these dramatic interactions. The dialogue between a philosopher, a Jew, and a Christian is an expression of this new recaptured sense, or new to Christendom, of Western civilization, the thought that we can talk to each other instead of fighting with each other. That's a beautiful thing. The other thing about the scholastic method is, have we lost something from the monastic in the sense of the embodiment of a way of life? Because the ancient philosophers certainly lived their philosophies as a way of life, as Pierre Hadot has talked about. Certainly the Stoics did. Stoicism was pervasive in the monastic ethos. And I want to link this with and use this as kind of a transition to Heloise, who was the one that Abelard lusted after and then loved, and then was the turning point of his life. She was born perhaps around 1090. The older dating had her a year younger, and that would have made this a little more scandalous, I guess, the love that they shared. But it's likely that, in fact, she was 10 years older than the accounts have. She was one of the most learned people of the age. She knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, which is that was remarkable for anyone, male or female. She's an amazing intellect, and so she embodied this love, the eros of the mind, this love for learning. She was in the care of her uncle Foubert, the Archdeacon of Paris. He wanted to advance her education and secure the services of Abelard, who had started to make a name for himself as a teacher. People were coming to Paris as just wanting to find, again, this was part of the rise of the university, this was a place where you could go and find teachers like in a vital marketplace and learn. And so this was different from the patterns of civilization up to this time in Europe. Well, Flaubert engaged Abelard to be the tutor of Heloise, and they fall in love. They have a child, Astrolabe, which was fascinating. This is Eloise's idea to name their child Astrolabe, which is a navigational instrument. It is a navigational instrument, I think, developed by the Muslims, right? And so, anyway, that's fascinating. They are secretly married. Now, this is one of the conundrums of the whole story. Flaubert was furious. Abelard had seduced Heloise, and she had been whisked away to his family to have the child, and it was Abelard's family who raised the child. Abelard tries to conciliate Flaubert by saying, I will marry Heloise, but it has to be in a secret marriage. Now, the literature, as far as I've read, has not given a fully convincing account as to why this was the path, that is, keeping it secret. Marriage makes sense. Keeping it secret doesn't. I think it has to do with the fact that teachers, masters at this time, had clerical status, even though they wouldn't necessarily be priests. But I'm not quite sure still why that would be the case. But it had something to do with his ambitions. Eloise, in her first letter to Abelard, thinks back upon this event and says, I never wanted anything in you but you alone, because she actually opposed the idea of marrying. She didn't want to marry. I never wanted anything in you but you alone, nothing of what you have but you yourself. Never a marriage, never a dowry, never any pleasure, any purpose of my own, as you well know, but only yours. The name of wife may have the advantages of sanctity and safety, but to me the sweeter name will always be lover, or if your dignity can bear it, concubine or whore. You kept your silence, though, about most of the reasons why I preferred love over marriage, freedom over a chain. So I call my God to witness now. If great Augustus, ruler of the world, ever thought to honor me by making me his wife and granted me dominion over the earth, it would be dearer to me and more honorable to be called not his royal consort, but your whore. And then she does something here that those are very interesting things. It tells you something about how passionate she was, how learned she was, how completely, this word falls flat in the face of her witness, nonconformist she was. It truly exemplifies this modern subjectivity, romantic, independent-minded. This letter is written 15 years after they had last talked. She loves this man. Always does, until her end, when she dies 20 years after he does. She wanted him to advance in the world. So she didn't want marriage. I mean, I think this makes sense. If they don't marry, then he could go into orders, and that would be a way to advance. That makes sense to me. The secret part, it's like Abelard was trying to split the difference, and it didn't make any sense. And it didn't. I think Eloise was much more clear-headed in that respect. Okay, so it was a secret marriage that doesn't save face for Flaubert. And because Eloise doesn't want to admit the marriage, she doesn't want to admit it. Flaubert's talking about saying, look, there's no scandal here. They're married. And Eloise keeps denying it. Flaubert's beating her because she's denying it. So Abelard whisks her away to an abbey, a convent, and I think the one she was raised in, the one at Argenteuil. Okay, Flaubert is furious. He thinks that Abelard is trying to get rid of his wife, disavow the marriage or whatever. He sends a couple of thugs in, and they castrate him. Now, it's a wonder, I think, that he survived. In any case, that obviously was a turning point in his life. At that point, Abelard says to Heloise, I want you to become a nun. And he becomes a monk at Saint Denis. She becomes a nun at Argenteuil, eventually rising to being prioress there. Okay, and then they go their separate ways. He doesn't write her for a decade and a half. Those letters, the first one is filled with this sense of, why didn't you write me? Here we are, the Abigail Adams Institute. I want to note there's a little bit, there's much more increased, but something of the passion that Abigail Adams is reproaching John for not writing. But this is far more. I mean, there's no, it's remarkable what she endures. Okay, Abelard then is on his own. He's working as a monk. he writes a book called Theology, basically naming the discipline. That is, the word had been used before, but now as Christian theology, as a specific pursuit, that's Abelard's invention as a conceptual thing. He's using logic to think even through the Trinity, so there's a kind of rationalist Trinitarianism. The big thing, of course, in his work that we know of, well, many things, his work on universals, but also intentionalist ethics. And here we have every reason to believe from the letters that this was a common project of Héloïse and Abelard. That is, the thought that the moral value of an action has everything to do with intention. This was, again, another sign of the modern subjectivity. Aquinas himself takes up intentionalist ethics, though adds back in the weight of the object, the moral object, the action, the nature of the action itself. But this is absolutely indispensable for our understanding of culpability, right? If I mean what I intend by my action does matter to the moral value of the action. And that is something that Héloïse and Abelard are the ones to put on the table. It is remarkable. And it really is not a matter of special pleading. It is clear that Héloïse was part of this conception. There's contact in the sense that in 1129, Héloïse eventually has her own order of nuns. She's forced out of where she is and has to go to the place that Abelard had set up a few years before, a hermitage at a place called the Paraclete. And so her order is there, and then a few years later they finally have their first letter. She reads the history of my calamities and she writes him. That's the breaking that 15 years of silence. I mean, it's a very kind of heartbreaking letter. I want to give another testament to her here. There's this wonderful poem by Pope Héloïse de Abelard. How oft when pressed to marriage have I said, curse on all laws but those which love has made. Love, free as air, at sight of human ties, spreads his light wings and in a moment flies. Let wealth, let honor wait the wedded dame. August her deed and sacred be her fame. Before true passion all those views remove. Fame, wealth, and honor, what are you to love? The jealous God, when we profane his fires, those restless passions in revenge inspires, and bids them make mistaken mortals groan, who seek in love for aught but love alone. Should at my feet the world's great master fall, himself, his throne, his world, I'd scorn them all. Not Caesar's empress would I deign to prove, no, make me mistress to the man I love. If there be yet another name more free, more fond than mistress, make me that to thee. O happy state when souls each other draw, when love is liberty and nature law. All then is full, possessing and possessed, no craving void left aching in the breast. Even thought meets thought, ere from the lips it part, and each warm wish springs mutual from the heart. This shore is bliss, if bliss on earth there be, and once the lot of Abelard and me. That gives you a sense of the vitality of the example of this love, which would go on to inspire troubadour poetry. It's clearly in the DNA of the West. Such a consequential philosopher, the most preeminent one of the 12th century, Peter Abelard, involved in this liaison. Héloïse here's, in some ways, even more remarkable. She goes on and lives this life in silence for most of the time, not able to communicate with the man she loves to the end. She becomes a conspicuously holy person. I mean, that she founds communities of nuns. She's living, but it's clear from the letter the eros of the mind has got her. She just loves. She loves to live out the life of the mind. So she's still doing this philosophy as a way of life in that monastic context. So now we kind of come around full circle. In 1140, Bernard of Clairvaux comes in after being tipped off by another one of these monastic types. Another great thinker, William of Saint-Thierry. Bernard charges Abelard with heresy, gets a synod to be convened at Sens, and his work is again condemned. He appeals to Rome. On the way down, he falls ill. He's taken in by Blessed Peter the Venerable at the great monastery at Cluny. There had been conflict between Bernard and Peter the Venerable. There's another story here. Bernard has obviously got a very beautiful mystical theology. He's the last of Dante's guides and all of that. But he preaches one of the Crusades, and he's clearly got a temper. So, but we're none of us perfect. So this is part that the denouement is that Abelard dies in the care of Peter the Venerable. Eventually, Peter has the bones disinterred and moved to be close to Eloise. It's a very beautiful act of Christian love there, and that's where we are. We've got a witness before us of a remarkable couple who live out intense passion, but also embody in their love the energy, the eros of the 12th century, this new civilization that's coming to birth, the Western heart and mind, which is really emerging into view here. And we need to ask ourselves, what in this can we look back on and say, that is something I want to live out in my life? What in this is just not a good idea to live out in my life? And what is left for us to live in a new way in the light of their example?